All right, I will say good morning. Let us begin. Beginning by thanking all of our sponsors, TALMUD TORAH sponsors for the month of Kislev, Josh of Mecca Friedman, Le'ilui Nishmas, Josh's father, Yisrael Yehuda Ben Yaakov, Refuah, Zichrono Livracha. To thank Sammy and Malka Esterson for dedicating the Shurim this month. All right, you could turn it up. It's fine. Just turn up the heat. All right. So Sammy and Malka Esterson, in memory of their parents, Yitzchak Leib ben haKohen, Sarah Rachel bas Baruch Avraham, and Hinda bas Henoch Efraim, as well as in the continued zechus of the Gesund and Hatzlacha from Mr. Morton Esterson, Ameh v'Esrim Shalom Tovos. To thank the Pepper family for dedicating all of the Shiurim this month, the commemoration of the yahrzeit of Yosef Pepper, Yosef Dovid Ben Yaakov. To thank our week of learning sponsor, Steve Goloskov, in honor of his daughter Rivi's upcoming wedding to Eli Bogart, and in commemoration of his father's upcoming first yahrzeit. The Pepper family, in honor of the zechus of Refuah Shleima for Yaakov ben Rachel, and a day of learning sponsors, Paul Pollack, in the zechus of Refuah Shleima for his wife Kathy Rivka bas Sarah, who is having surgery today. The surgery should be with incredible hatzlacha. She should have a Refuah Shelaima together with Kol Chol Yisrael. With that, let us begin. A very interesting daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Lamed Daled, 34. We are picking up in Meretz Hashem on the top of Lamed Daled, 34. So if you remember again, we ended up with the following idea. So the Mishnah spoke about the following case. I make a neder that Reuven is not permitted to get any benefits from me. So we'll say this has actually been the topic of the last two Mishnayos. We started this. This is how the third parak began. So if you remember again, in the first Mishnah, we spoke about the fact that if I make a neder that Reuven can't get hana from me, we went through the list of activities, or there's the list of things that Reuven cannot borrow, and the list of things that Reuven cannot do. In the last Mishnah in yesterday's daf, we spoke about what are the things that I can do for Reuven that are not considered to be an act of hana. So in that list, if you remember again, there was, I can give Reuven's half shekel, I can go ahead and pay off Reuven's debt, because remember again, the Gemara said those are not considered hana, because the definition of hana is what? Is what? Giving something to someone that they did not have before. But the concept of going ahead and chasing away a creditor or satisfying a debt in halacha is called mavriach ari minichsei chavero. Fascinating. So again, yesterday, the other idea that the Mishnah said that I could do is I can go ahead and return a lost object. So halacha l'maaseh, return a lost object, and if there's normally a fee that's given to the returner when he goes in and does that, that fee should ultimately go to hektish. Good, that was the Mishnah. The end of yesterday's daf, we spoke about this idea about who's returning who to what, right? And the Gemara had a machlokes about what exactly is the situation in which you are permitted to go ahead and return a lost object. So the Gemara brought down a machlokes in Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi about whose property is prohibited to and how exactly it works. That machlokes went ahead and centered on whether or not we subscribe to the concept of pruta de Rav Yosef. What's Chazar yesterday's daf, right? What's pruta of Rav Yosef? Pruta of Rav Yosef will say is this idea that halacha l'maisa, when you are engaged in the performance of a mitzvah, osik b'mitzvah pater min mitzvah, which means technically speaking, at the time that I'm returning a lost object, if somebody were to ask me for tzedakah, I would what? I'd be pater. Because of osik b'mitzvah pater min mitzvah. So halacha l'maisa, is that called hana or not? And even if it is called hana, perhaps again it's so unlikely that the request for tzedakah and the returning of the lost object are going to coincide in that fashion. So, okay, that's the machlokes. Top of Lamed Daled. So continuing along a little bit in this machlokes, Bish says, Tanan, Makom shenot lin ala schar tipal hana lehektish. So remember again, the Mishnah said that in a place where ultimately again you are given a reward for returning a lost object, that schar, that reward should really be given to hektish, because l'maisa, it can't be nana. Shabbos say, what's the case? So bishlam l'man damar afilu kishenichsei balavei dasurim amachzir nami mahader. Shabbos say, according to the opinion who holds that even if the property of the person who lost the object is prohibited upon the person who is returning the object, you could still go ahead and return the object. Hainu diktani makom shenotna le'eschar tipol ala hana lehektish. Then I will say that could be a case. That makes sense because then I can still return the object, but there is still maybe some hana involved, and therefore again the Mishnah is saying that the hana should ultimately go to hektish. Elaman do amar kishin nichse bal aveda asurim al machzir lo mahader. But I will say, according to the opinion who holds that when the property of the person who lost the object is prohibited upon the person who is returning the object, so therefore I will say, and therefore halacha l'maisa lo mahader. Therefore you can't. Therefore the finder can't return the object in that situation because l'maisa again that would be called getting hana. Ultimately, again, from the person who that is called getting hana, and you can't do that because of the neder. Amai tipol hana lehektish. Then what's the case? Ultimately, again, of tipol hana lehektish, to which the Gemara says, "You're right." Achado katani. The truth is, I will say that phrase of tipol hana lehektish only goes on one particular case. It doesn't devolve. That statement is not necessarily attached to both cases. Okay. So we'll see an alternate version of this. Again, we'll see the halacha lamais at the end of this road as well. Others have a different version of this. So the Gemara says, Pligi ba Rabbi Ami Rabbi Asi. So there's machlokes Rabbi Ami Rabbi Asi. Chad Amar lo shanu ela shenichsei. So we'll say, so again, this is an alternate version of the same machlokes, right? Remember again, this whole thing started with a machlokes Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi. Now there's an alternate version of this machlokes. So here we go. Chad Amar, one says, Lo shanu ela b'shenichse bal aveda asturin al machzir. So I will say one opinion says, we're only talking about a case where the property of the bal aveda, so the property of the person who lost the object, is usher to the person who is returning the object. Right? Umishum pruta derav Yosef lo shiach. Yet, we'll say, so in this case over here, let's just call it like this. Reuven lost the object. Shimon found the object. It also happens to be that Reuven is the one who made the neder, precluding Shimon from getting benefits from his property. Okay? So now Reuven loses an object. Shimon finds the object. Now the question is Shimon allowed to return the object to Reuven? So the first opinion says yes. Why? Umishum pruta d'Rav Yosef lo shchiach. Because we'll say, what do we have to be concerned about? We have to be concerned maybe the pruta of Rav Yosef, which is what? That maybe when Shimon is returning the object, what's going to happen? While he's returning the object, an ani, a poor person, is going to ask him for tzedakah, and in that moment, what's going to be the halacha? What's going to be the halacha? Osek b'mitzvah pata min mitzvah. So it turns out that Shimon is benefiting from the property of Reuven, which is something he's not allowed to do under the terms of the neder that Reuven made. But again, this opinion holds that pruta d'Rav Yosef is lo shchiach. It's not common. It's not common. And therefore, again, therefore we don't have to be worried about that kind of hana, and therefore Shimon couldn't return the property to Reuven. Aval, however, nichse machzir asurim abal aveda. But I both say, listen to this. But if, let's say again, if Shimon's property is ultimately usher to Reuven, so remember, Reuven is the one who lost the object, Shimon found the object, Shimon now wants to return the object to Reuven. Aval nichse machzir. But if the property of Shimon is usher to Reuven, aval nichse machzir asurim abal aveda lo mahader. Ultimately, again, he should not return it. Shimon should not return the lost object to Reuven. Why? Because Shimon is ultimately giving benefit, again, to Reuven. Shimon's giving benefit to Reuven. I will say, how is Shimon giving benefit to Reuven? If you look at Rashi says over here, 2-3 lines in the wide lines of Rashi, Mishum dekamahanile, da'afagav demeidam denafshe mahadole. Even though Shimon is returning Reuven's object to Reuven, right? In other words, I will say, just to be clear, let's frame this case. Reuven lost an object. Shimon found the object. Okay, so now I will say, what's the complicating factor over here? The complicating factor is that Shimon made a neder prohibiting Reuven from getting any benefit from his property. So now I will say, we're saying that Allah Chalamayis, Shimon can't return the object to Reuven, because if Shimon were to return the object to Reuven, Reuven would be getting benefit from Shimon, and that's in violation of the neder. Now Rashi says over here, now what's the hana? What's the hana that Reuven would be getting? Because remember again, what is Reuven getting back from Shimon? What is he getting back from Shimon? His own object that he lost. Rashi says, Afagav, the midam dinafshi mehadrele. Even though Shimon is returning Reuven's object to him, afilu hachi mahanile, the dami kiman de mahanile minachasav. See, I will say, at the end of the day, Shimon is providing Reuven with a service. That's what's the service? What's the service? Returning a lost object. That service is a form of hana. That service is a form of hana, and therefore halacha l'maisa, Shimon would not be permitted to go ahead and return the object. I will say, by the way, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking 1 second. That means the neder is running contrary to Torah. So Rabbi say, so remember again, we made this, it's an excellent question. We made this distinction a little bit earlier on. So remember, a neder devolves upon an object. So because a neder devolves upon an object, it's you could technically have a neder that runs contrary to Torah law. What can't you have? You can't have a shavua that runs contrary to Torah law. Why? Because shavua devolves upon the individual. So I can't create a reality upon my person that runs contrary to Torah law. I can create a reality for an object that runs contrary to Torah law. The interesting part over here is that there's this little bit of a tension because the service that Shimon is providing for Reuven, what's the service? It's a service of the self, right? The service of the self. So interesting. Okay, so the Gemara doesn't seem to feel that it runs contrary to biblical law. It's interesting. Okay, and Vechadar, so we'll say, so that's one opinion. Vechadar, the other opinion says, no. Afilu nichse machzir asurim al balaveda, back to the Gemara, mutter. It's not trouble. So even in this case, right? Reuven lost the object, Shimon found the object, but Shimon also had prior to this made a neder prohibiting Reuven from getting any benefits from his property. The second opinion says Shimon could still return the object. Why could he still return the object? So the Gemara says, Dechi mahadrele midi dinafshi mahadrele. They will say, if you think about it, Shimon is not providing a benefit to Reuven. What is he giving to Reuven? That which he already owned, which I will say works very beautifully with our pre-existing definition of hana. Remember again, what's the definition of hana? Again, what's the definition of hana? Something additional you did not have before. But giving, so up until now, what we've said is kind of chasing away the lion. Right, preventing the creditor from coming. That's not called hana because the individual's not getting anything more. So too, when Reuven loses an object and you give him back his object, you're not giving him something new. Right? That was his beforehand. It's his now. That's not called hana either. So therefore, I will say, interestingly enough, in this alternate version of the discussion, the machlokes centers around the case one more time, where Reuven loses the object. Shimon finds the object. Okay, that's part one of the story. Truth is, I should really say differently. Part one of the story is Shimon made a neder prohibiting Reuven from getting any benefit from himself, from his property, from himself. Okay, that's part one of the story. Part two of the story, Reuven lost an object, Shimon found it. So now what's the machlokes? Is Shimon allowed to go ahead and return the object? So first opinion says, absolutely not. Absolutely not. Why? Because Lamaisa, Shimon returning the object is a form of hana. And therefore, Aloch Lamaisa, Shimon can't give hana to Reuven because that's in violation of the terms of the neder that Shimon himself made. Right? So opinion number two, that's not called hana. Hana means giving someone something additional. Here, Shimon is simply returning to Reuven that which Reuven already owned, and therefore, Aloch Lamaisa, that is not called hana. Okay, so we'll say, so this is the newly reframed form of the machlokes. Okay. Tanan. So we'll say now let's analyze. So that's the machlokes. So now let's analyze who learns the Mishnah. Tanan. Makom shenotlin aleh schar tipol hana lehektish. So what did the Mishnah say? That even when there is a neder presence, right, if you're still allowed to go, so the Mishnah said, you're allowed to return a lost object. And if there is hana, right, so if there is some reward, ultimately again, that reward, you should give it away. You should give it to Hektish. So let's analyze this. So we'll say this makes a lot of sense according to the opinion that says, even when Shimon, the returner, right? Even when Shimon the Machzir, even when Shimon's property is usher upon Ruvain, Shimon could still return the lost object. Hainu dimitaretz makom. So we'll say, I understand now why the Mishnah adds in makom in a place where ultimately again it's normal to get schar. Because we'll say that makes a lot of sense. Because in this case, halacha l'maisa, what we're saying is it's permitted for Shimon to go and return the lost object. And in a place where they normally pay someone for this service, Shimon, you can return the object because the act of returning is not called hana. But if Reuven is going to pay you money for this, that you have to give to Hektish. It makes a lot of sense. Elaman da'amar b'shenichsei machzir asurn v'lo mahader heichi mitaris makom. But I will say, according to the opinion that says that Shimon is not allowed to return the object to Reuven because that is called a form of hana, then what is the Mishnah talking about? Right? Remember, Shimon can't even return the object. If Shimon can't return the object, Rabbi say, then what? Then there's no discussion about reward. So what is the Mishnah talking about? Kasha. That is a good question. So therefore, Rabbi say, where the Gemara is holding right now, in this second version, before we move on, in this second version, because it's actually the end of the discussion, where the Gemara is holding right now is in this second version. One opinion makes sense, one opinion doesn't make sense. So we'll say, let's just go back, just so we have this klar. In this second version of Osai, what's the machlokes? The machlokes centers, Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi centers on one case. Right? Part one of the case, Shimon made a neder, Reuven, you cannot get any benefit from any of my property. Good. Part one. Part two, Reuven loses an object, Shimon finds it. What's the shayla? Can Shimon return the lost object to Reuven? It's a machlokes. First opinion says, first opinion is Rabbi Ami. Right? Rabbi Ami says yes. Why? That's not called hana. It's not called hana, right? Shimon is just giving Reuven back that which already belonged to Reuven. It's not called hana. Rabbi Asi, absolutely not. Absolutely not. It is called hana. Why? Because any benefit from Shimon or from his property is called benefiting from Shimon's property, and therefore it's aser. The Gemara says, okay, let's plug this into the Mishnah. What did the Mishnah say? You're allowed, in the case of a neder, I see, even where Shimon went ahead and made the neder, he could return an object to Reuven. So this makes sense according to Rabbi Ami. What does Rabbi Asi do with this? Because Rabbi say, according to Rabbi Asi, if halacha l'maisa, Shimon can't return the object, then what? There's no discussion about reward or what happens. The discussion about what to do with the reward only comes if what? If the return of the object is permitted. But according to Rabbi Asi, right, the second approach, the return of the object is prohibited because it's a form of hana. If you can't return the object, there's no discussion about reward. To which the Gemara says, kasha. That is a good question. Shabbos says, so this effectively is the end of this sugya. So how do we pass in this case, Shabbos say? So listen to this. It's actually quite interesting. Shabbos say, the Rambam, in Hilchos Nedarim, Perek Zayin Halacha Aleph. Listen to this. Shnayim shene'esru hana, kol echad men al chavero, bein b'neder, bein b'shur. So we'll say, so whatever case where you have two people, and one of them, or for that matter, both of them, made a neder or a shvuah, doesn't really matter, neder or a shvuah, not to get hana from each other. So we'll say, so let's just keep the case simple. Right? So Shimon made, let's keep it consistent with our case. Shimon made a neder not to get any benefit from Reuven. What happens? So now, or I should say differently. Shimon made a neder that Reuven should not get any benefits from him. Now what happens? Reuven finds a lost object, or vice versa, or if both of them make nedarim. What's the halacha? We'll say, listen to this. Hari elu mutarin lahachsir aveda zelazeh. Incredible. They are permitted to go ahead and return the lost object one to the other. Why? Get ready for this. Mipnei shehu mitzvah. That's how the Rambam Paskins will say. The Rambam says at the end of the day, now what's his logic? Shehu mitzvah, therefore what? Shabbos says, listen to this. This is part of the overarching principle that we have throughout Shas of mitzvos lav lehanos nitnu. A mitzvah is not considered to be a form of hana. Not considered to be a form of hana. Therefore, halacha l'maaseh, the act of returning a lost object is the mitzvah of hashavas aveda, and is not considered the conference of benefit one on the other. By the way, I'll give you another example of this. Another example of this, that halacha l'maaseh could very well be that according to this logic, if Shimon makes a neder that Reuven can't get any benefit from him, and what happens? Reuven and Shimon daven in the same shul. One day Reuven forgets his tefillin. They're both say, what's the halacha if you forgot your tefillin and you see someone's tefillin lying on the table? Are you allowed to borrow it without permission? Yes. And it's just interesting enough you're allowed to, based on the principle of necha le'inish le'me'avid mitzvah mamone. The default assumption is that Jews are happy when someone else uses their object for a mitzvah. Now, this doesn't mean that, let's say, you could take someone's wallet, empty out the cash, and say, people want me to do mitzvahs with their... No. Right? What it means is, it refers to non-depletable resources. So tefillin, which is not going to be depleted if someone else uses it, halacha l'maisa, you can use someone's tefillin without asking. In other words, if they're there, obviously it's always good to ask permission. But sometimes it's a different minyan, they're not there. So you can use a person's tefillin even without asking. So based on this, so if Shimon made a neder that Reuven, you can't get any benefit from me, halacha l'maisa, Reuven would be permitted to go ahead and use Shimon's tefillin. Much in the same way that they can return lost objects to each other, because the performance of a mitzvah is not called hana. Quite amazing. However, the Rambam goes on, but if you live in a place where it's customary that when someone returns a lost object, you pay them a couple of dollars. By the way, just what's the genesis of that minhag? What's the genesis? So in general, hashavas aveda generally requires some level of exertion. Right? You have to find the person, you have to track down the person, you have to take time. So therefore, again, where it was customary to give a person a couple of dollars, yipol haschar lehekdish. They're both saying, now listen to this. Listen to this, it's incredible. So you have to give the schar to tzedakah. Now, both say, now that's interesting, because I would have thought, now, when you hear that, what do you think to yourself? So let's play this out. Shimon made it neder not to convey any benefit, confer or convey any benefit to Reuven. Reuven loses an object, Shimon finds it. Could Shimon return the object? Should return it? Yes. He shows up at Reuven's house, returns the object. Reuven takes out $100 bill. What does Shimon do? Right? Shabbos says, here's what's interesting. So he has to give it to tzedakah. So it's interesting, because at least when I saw this halacha originally, anything to Yisrael, he says no thank you. The Rambam says, no. He has to take the money and give it to tzedakah. Why? Listen to this. Shem yitol schar nimsenene, because if Shimon accepts the money, turns out that he's getting benefit. Vim lo yitol, and if he doesn't accept it, nimtza mahana, then he's giving benefit. See, I will say, listen to this. So if he accepts it, he's getting benefit, and if he declines it, he's giving benefit to Reuven, and that's like, so in other words, if the money's being offered, the money has to be taken and given to tzedakah, and in order that neither one of the prohibited parties, if there are two prohibited parties, gets any kind of benefit. Good. So we'll say, that's the halacha l'maaseh, a really fascinating idea, but an important yisod. Mitzvos lav lehanos nitnu. A mitzvah is not considered to be hana'ah, and therefore, even if someone is enjoined from deriving benefit, al seneder, it doesn't preclude the ability to perform a mitzvah on that person's behalf. Incredible. Gurba says, go weiter. Amid Beis. Really interesting Gemara here. Amir Rava, listen to this. Haisa lefanav kikar shel hefker. So we'll say, listen to this. Let's say there was in front of me a kikar of hefker. Now, this case we're going to see. This is really just a lead in to the next case. You'll see, because it doesn't really have that. The Ram points out it doesn't really have that much to do with our Gemara. So the Rava says, "Haisa lefanav kikar shel hefker." So we'll say there was an ownerless loaf in front of me. Kikar shel hefker va'amar kikar zu hegdish. I will say, what do? I say this kikar, this loaf should be hegdish. Okay. That's fine. You can do that. So natla la'ochla. So we'll say if you picked it up now to eat it, ma'al lefikula. So we'll say if committed me'ilah, what's the amount of me'ilah? What's the amount? Right? How do we quantify the me'ilah? The value of the loaf. Value of the loaf. But also remember again, what is me'ilah? Me'ilah means illegal personal usage of consecrated or sacred items. So this loaf is ownerless. You said the loaf belongs to Hekdish. Now you pick it up in order to go ahead and eat it. you have committed Me'ilah. I will say, by the way, if you'll notice, it's interesting, when is Me'ilah committed? When is Me'ilah committed? The moment you pick it up with the intention to eat it, which is actually very interesting. If you look at Rashi, Rashi says over here, so Rashi understands it over here as the moment you pick it up, you've acquired it, but the Me'ilah really only comes about when you eat it. When you eat it. So this in of itself is subject to a bit of machlok. So we can go, again, like I said, it's not really our primary topic, but it's just interesting. Rashi's approach is, you pick it up, you acquire it, but Me'ilah is actually committed when you actually eat it. Fine. What happens? L'horisha l'banav. So we'll say, very interesting. Let's say I pick up the loaf, now with the intention to eat it, but instead, I'm going to go ahead and leave it for my children's inheritance. Okay. So we'll say, so, by the way, you could pick this up, but you could think about this as a case of a guy, literally, he's on the last leg of life's journey, right? In other words, last breaths, why he's choosing to commit an act of Me'ilah in his final moments in this world, but he's about to die. He decides, you know what? Or it could be like sourdough. What kind of bread lasts for a long time? Is sourdough? Or whatever. Anyway, he's going ahead, and it's a box of matzahs, right? Yeah. He's going ahead, and he's deciding, I'm not going to eat it. Rather, again, I'm going to give this to this is going to be the Yerusha for my children. So now what happens in this case? Ma'al Lifi Tovas Hanoah Sheba. So it's very interesting. So he's committed Me'ilah, but the value of the Me'ilah, Rabosai, is not the value of the loaf. Why is that? Because remember again, he didn't consume the loaf. So the value of the Me'ilah, Rabosai, is what we call Tovas Hanoah. We'll say, what's Tovas Hanoah? Tovas Hanoah is the amount of benefit one acquires. So in this case, I will say, what we do is we quantify the benefit. Really, the benefit that the father gets is the goodwill. The children know our father loves us, because again, he's leaving us an additional loaf as part of the Yerusha. So however you quantify that goodwill is the amount of the Me'ilah. I will say, take a quick look at the Ran. So we'll say this is the last line right before the widest lines. So the Ran says over here, L'horish l'banav ma'al lefi tovas hanoah sheba. So says the Ran, Kevan de lo hikbiya ela l'horish l'banav v'lo sheyichna osa achshav. When the father picks it up, his intention is not to acquire the loaf right now. That's not his intention. What is his intention? To ultimately, again, pick up the loaf in order to convey ownership of the loaf to his children later on. Lo nafka l'chulin. It's very interesting. So when the father picks it up, because it's not his intention to acquire it now, but rather only to convey it to his children sometime later on, it doesn't leave hektish to go to chulin. So say, the way Me'ilah works is that when you take a consecrated item and use it for your own mundane use, it leaves hektish and comes into chulin. Therefore, again, you're responsible for the entire value of the item. So there's a loaf of hektish. I go and I pick it up and I eat it. When I eat it, it leaves hektish, comes into chulin. I'm responsible now for the entire amount. In this case, I'm not acquiring it for myself. In this case, what am I doing? I'm acquiring the loaf I'm picking it up with the intention to bequeath it to my children. So therefore, the amount of Me'ilah I've committed is not the value of the entire loaf, because I have not acquired it for myself. I've only acquired it to the intention to pass it on to my children later on. Therefore, again, the value of my Me'ilah is the Tovas Hanoah, the goodwill that I ultimately, again, create with my children. Ubanav molin l'chishiyotziu. Now, I will say, it's interesting. Where does actual Me'ilah occur? Actual Me'ilah occurs when I die. My children take the loaf and eat the loaf. That's when the complete Me'ilah occurs. So there's a partial Me'ilah that's happening, but the partial Me'ilah with me is only what we call the Tovas. And I will say, by the way, it's actually very beautiful. If you think about this, you'll say to yourself, but it's just a loaf of bread. How much Tovas Hanoah? Right? How much goodwill? So if you look at the words of the Ran, are actually very beautiful. The end of the first wide line and the beginning of the second wide line. Kevan shu machzer l'horisham. Shabbos say, when children know that the father is trying to acquire property for a Yerusha, even though in this case it's just what? It's just a loaf of bread, there's goodwill in that. See, there was like goodwill in life comes when children see that parents try. That parents try. See, I will say, often this goodwill only occurs when we're older. Because when we're young, we very often do not appreciate the efforts that our parents put in. Right? Often we become frustrated, disillusioned, upset, angry, rebellious. And as you get older, we recognize that although maybe my parent did make many mistakes, but they tried. And they really tried a lot. And it's that trying that a parent puts in, it's that effort that a parent puts in, that a child really comes to appreciate. That becomes a tovas hana'ah. It's a fashdunk in a loaf. What kind of Yerusha is this? Lamaisa, my father's trying to put together a Yerusha. And that in and of itself engenders the goodwill. Good. So we'll say, so therefore the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says, so first of all, the Ran then goes on to say, why is this here? Why is this here? V'hada aisi. Hacha hach member the Rabba mishum the Ramile lahach bayit the bar mirav chibar avin heichi the hacha mak heichi the hacha heik the shakikar va'achagach not ali achla. So we'll say, why is this here? We're going to see why it's here in just a moment, because this case is similar to the one that comes after. So we'll say, here's the case we're really focusing on. Back to the Gemara, 4 lines down from the top. So we'll say, so therefore again, Rava's case, you have a loaf, the owner of this loaf, you make it hekdesh. Case 1, you pick it up to eat it, you're chayiv milah for the full value of the loaf. Case 2, you don't eat it, but rather you pick it up with the intention to go ahead and bequeath it to your children as an inheritance. You're a chayiv for milah, but only for the amount of the tovas hana, the goodwill that it engenders with your children. Good. Here we go. Back to our sugya. Kikari alecha v'nosna lo b'matana. Oh, interesting. So we'll say, so listen to this. Reuven says to Shimon, Kikari alecha, my kikar, my loaf is usher to you. A neder. Right? I make a neder that my loaf is usher to you. Okay? Now we'll say, now what happens? Listen to this. Now, Reuven gives the very same loaf to Shimon as a matana, as a gift. So what's the halacha mahu? What's the status now? So do we say, Kikari amarlo, ki isa b'rshusei hu da'asa? So we'll say, on one end you can say, listen, what was the neder? What was the neder? Reuven said, my loaf. When is it my loaf? When it's in my reshus. But now that I've conveyed ownership to you of this loaf as a gift, it's no longer my loaf. Now it's what? Now it's your loaf. And as your loaf, it's not aser. And therefore the loaf should be permitted. O Dilma, alayich amrlei, iluye shevise hektish. Or I will say maybe not. Maybe when I say, right, or I should say when Reuven says, kikari alecha, maybe what Reuven is actually saying to Shimon is what? My loaf should be like hektish to you. And I will say, when he says it's be like hektish to you, then what? Then Lamaisa, that status remains even if Reuven subsequently gifts the loaf to Shimon. I will say, so here the Shaila, very interesting. So again, Reuven says to Shimon, Kikari alecha, ultimately again, my loaf is usher to you. Now Reuven conveys the very same loaf to Shimon as a gift. What happens? Do we see on one hand, halacha lamaisa, the loaf is now permitted, because the prohibition was only when it was Reuven's loaf. But now that it's Shimon's loaf, it's okay. Or no, Reuven effectively made this loaf like hektish, legabi Shimon, and therefore even though now he's gifting it to Shimon, the loaf still remains asa. But say if you take a look at the Ran for just a moment, so the Ran 2, 4, 5 lines down the wide lines, O Dilma, alecha amrle, v'iluye shavi hektish, taki kamrle, zu shi achshav kikari. What Reuven is actually saying is, this loaf, which is right now mine, asura alecha li'olam. It's forbidden to you forever. Forever. So we'll say that's the Shilas. Here we go. Amrle, pshita, di'afagav di'yoy v'le matana aser. So we'll say, so he said to him, so remember again, this is Rabbi Chibar Avin asking from Rava. Rava said, it's pashit, aser. Aser. Even if Reuven gave it to Shimon as a gift, at the end of the day, the Isser still remains. Isser still remains. Good. So the Gemara says, good. Fine. Okay, let's go back to Ella. So therefore, Rava is about to tell you. So therefore, if yes, there's no question. When Reuven gives Shimon the gift of a loaf, the loaf is absolutely unequivocally still remains asar. Now, what Rava must be saying is, because essentially when you make a neder, when Reuven made the neder, that my loaf should be prohibited to you, essentially with the way we interpret Reuven's neder, is he was making the loaf like hekdish. Says Rava, but I'll tell you what is the shaila. Listen to this. Ella kikari alayich la fugemai. Shabbos says, so therefore we see like this. But when Reuven does say kikari alayich, does it exclude anything? In other words, Shabbos say, is there a case where maybe the loaf does become permitted to Shimon? Is there some type of case where let's say again you can where is there some kind of situation? So I was like, what is Rabbi Chia Avin really asking a Rava? What is he really asking? What he's asking is, when Reuven says kikari alecha, is there some point in time where it's what? No longer kikari? Is there some point in time where it's no longer called or no longer considered my loaf? Or is it forever considered to be Reuven's loaf and therefore usher to Shimon? So let's listen to this. Ella kikari alecha la fuke mai lav la afuke di'i ganva mine mignav. So I said, this is interesting. Is it coming to go ahead and exclude a case where maybe Rabbi say where Shimon stole the loaf from Reuven? There's Rabbi say, listen to this. Maybe the case where the loaf would now. There's two ways to understand this particular line. It could either mean where Shimon himself is stealing the loaf, and maybe we will say, there's an interesting concept by a Ganov, which is the kinyane gineva, or kinyane gizela, which means when a thief steals an object, he actually acquires the object. It actually becomes his. So is it possible to say that maybe if Shimon goes ahead and steals the loaf from Reuven, he'll say maybe, again, I want to be clear, still an act of theft, and there's still liability for the theft, but maybe the neder is lifted from that object. In other words, maybe the object is no longer usher to Shimon out the neder. It's usher because of theft, but maybe the object becomes, so to speak, permitted for consumption because neder is lifted. Rashi has a different understanding of this case. The Ran also is slightly different of this case. We're not going to get into it right now because the Gemara says, no. Even in a case where the loaf was stolen, it still retains its prohibited identity. So I'll say, so what is the case in question? This is fascinating. Wow. Rabbi say, listen to this case. What about the following situation? Reuven makes a neder and he says, kikari alecha, right? Shimon, my loaf is prohibited to you. So what have we established? Even if Reuven gifts the loaf to Shimon, what's the halacha? Still aser. Sounds like even if the gift is stolen from Reuven, either by Shimon himself or by someone else, and give it to Shimon, still aser. Furthermore, again, so what's the case? So we'll say, what's the case in question? The case in question is Reuven invites Shimon over for dinner. And I will say, guess what's on the table? Guess what's on the table? The loaf. The loaf is there. So I'll say, now what's the shaila? The shaila is Shimon allowed to eat the loaf? Now what's the shaila? Now look at the Ran. I'll say, last round on the page. This is so great. So the Ran says, Kilomar, the olam imulacha, tirve matana sharia. So okay, the Ran's version over here is maybe if he gives them as a matana, it's permitted. Di azamna alei tisarla dahi shaita nami kikarahu. See, Rabbi say, here's what's interesting. When you go over to someone's house to eat, so let's play this out. Right? So just a regular case. So right, I go over to Reuven's house. Shabbos lunch, he invited me over. I'm sitting down at the table. Right, there's a plate of food, some chavint and some kishka and some kugel. Right, and what happens? Let's say that plate of food. Whose food is that? Do we say now that food is on my plate? That food is mine, right? That food belongs to me. Is that true? Or is it that halacha l'maisa? No, that food remains the food of the balabayas. It's the balabayas' food. He's just allowing me to eat of his food. And both say, by the way, what's one nafkamina of this? So both say, this is actually a Choshen Mishra case. What's one of the nafkamina keys? This was say, you know what? Ruvain, by the way, the brisket was excellent, right? I take 4 more pieces on my plate. I say, can you pack this up for me? Can you pack this up for me? And also, when you are a guest at someone's house, are you allowed to take food you're allowed to take food home without their rishus, right? Or, right, now the nafkamina is, if you put it on your plate, does it become yours? And therefore you could just take it home? Or no, you're allowed to eat what you're allowed to eat, the suda. But you want to take stuff home, that requires explicit rishus. And if you don't get explicit rishus, that's an act of theft. That's an act of gezel. So the nafkamina, the shayla is, when you get food at someone's home, is that your food or the balabayas' food? Then we'll say, here it is. So watch this. Reuven made a neder and he said, Kikari alecha. Right, Shimon, you cannot eat my kikar, you cannot eat my loaf. Now what happens? He invites Shimon over for dinner. Shabbos says, now the loaf is on the table. So what's the shayla? I will say? Is it considered to be Reuven's loaf? In which case, Kikari alecha, Shimon, you can't eat it. Or maybe anything on the table, ultimately, again, is considered to be Shimon's. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, he's permitted to go ahead and take it. So he wants to suggest that halacha l'maisa, in that case, it's still considered to be Reuven's loaf. It's still considered to be Kikari, my loaf, Reuven's loaf. And therefore, Shimon would be prohibited from going ahead and partaking of it. So we'll say, let's go back to it. We're not finished yet. Again, we're not finished. So Esvei, so the Gemara raises the kasha. Esvei, Amar lo hishilani parascha. So I say, listen to this. I say to Reuven, do me a favor, lend me your cow. Amar lo, konaim para shani kanoi lecha, nechasi alecha, im yeshli para elazu. Okay, so I say, this is interesting. So Reuven says, this para should be prohibited to you like a carbon. This para that I own, that I acquired, should be usher to you like a carbon if I have any other para. And I both say, it's interesting. Sometimes you just tell people, like, just say what you mean, right? In other words, so Reuven's trying to say over in this case is, what Reuven's trying to say is, listen, I only have one par. I can't lend it out to you. I'm so sorry. So the way Reuven says that is, this para should be usher to you like a carbon if I have any other par. So Reuven's saying is, I have no other par. Now it turns out, I'll say that what? Or, Hishilani kardumecha, I asked Reuven, can I borrow your axe? Amrlo, and he says to me, Konim kardum shieshli sha'ani kanoi. This axe should be ushered to like a carbon, right? If sha'ani kanoi nechasi alai im yeshli kardum elazeh. If I have any other axe. And it turns out, v'nimsa sheyesh lo b'chayav. Right? Sheyesh lo. And it turns out that what? That in fact he has another cow and he has another axe. So what's halacha b'asai? So ultimately b'chayav aser. So now what this means is during Reuven's lifetime, his cows, his axes are going to be aser to me. Mace, if he dies, o shenasna lo b'matana. Or ultimately again, or if halacha l'maisa, right? Mace, or he gives me as matana, harei ze motor. Oh. I will say, whoa, what just happened over here? What just happened over here? What did you see from this case? Right? So I will say, so to make a long story short, Reuven triggered a neder. He triggered a neder. And now what happened? As a result of that neder, his cows are usher to me. So what's one of the ways he could circumvent the neder? He could gift me property. Gift me property. We just said before that what? When you gift someone an object that is prohibited by a neder, the neder status still remains. Right? That's what we said before. Reuven says to Shimon, Kikari alecha, my loaf is prohibited to you. And then what happens? He gifts Shimon the loaf. The loaf still remains prohibited. Still remains Reuven's loaf. Now we just saw that if something is prohibited under a neder and you gift it to someone else, then halacha l'maisa what? Halacha l'maisa, it becomes permitted. So what's going on over here? To which the Gemara says, no. Amrav acher b'id Rav Ika, shenitna lo al yedei acher. Oh, very interesting, I both say. There are different ways of giving a gift. One way of giving a gift is direct gift giving, which is Reuven gives to Shimon, and then there's another way of giving a gift, which is what? Reuven gives to Levi, who gives it to Shimon. Should I say, what's the distinction between the two? When it's a direct gift, the status, the prohibited status still remains. When Reuven gives the gift to an unrelated party, the status goes away, which makes sense, because now someone unrelated to the two parties ultimately again is involved, the status goes away, and then it allows the gift ultimately to be transferred to Shimon, so Isser free. I will say, we'll have to stop over here for today. I got a little ambitious on Amud Aleph. We'll stop over here for today. I will say, again, I just want you to say, here's where we're ending off. Reuben went ahead and said, Kikari Alecha. So I will say, we essentially now have really one outstanding question, because we've established this, even if Reuben goes in and invites Shimon over for dinner, that loaf still remains prohibited. What we're really now going back to focus on is, if Reuben gifts that loaf to Shimon, does the prohibited status go away? We thought the answer to that was no. Now the Gemara just gave us a case that it sounds like gifting a prohibited item, the prohibition goes away. How to reconcile the two? And the halacha l'maisa, Im Yirtzeh Hashem tomorrow, Shkoyach.